can see the professor at UNB, Trevor.
We just met in
Hanson.
the morning.
Hanson.
We
Did you?
just met in the morning. We have a PhD defense for UNB.
Oh, yes?
So Eric, Trevor,
Okay.
like the whole group was there.
Trevor and I have done some work on critical infrastructure and protests and traffic
Terms
sims.
are way better than
He
when I
built a
went
little
to university.
built a simulation for us to look at the effect of traffic protests on the Trans-Canada Highway. So it dates back to the truckers' blockades and gasoline protests. It was disruptive protests.
Felt the wrath. Okay, super.
He scares
Start
me.
now. Yeah, that's exactly why he does the job he does. That's why we hired him. So, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Kevin Quigley. I'm the director of the MacEachen Institute for Public Policy and Governance. Thanks so much for joining us today on our discussion of evacuation and emergency management. We start today by acknowledging that Dalhousie University is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral land of the Mi'kmaq. I'd also like to make a quick note, remind everyone that this Thursday, the MacEachen Institute with CISEPA, the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs, will be welcoming Bob Ray to St. Mary's University to give a talk on ethical considerations in Canada's foreign public policy. And we hope you will be able to join us. Of course, he'll be talking in particular about the Rohingya crisis. So last year, Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Jose, and Maria resulted in considerable damage to the countries in the Caribbean and the southeastern United States. Hurricane Harvey caused considerable damage in the state of Texas, and particularly in the city of Houston. The total cost of damage from Hurricane Harvey was approximately $125 billion. Less than a month later, Hurricane Maria landed on the coast of Puerto Rico, and recent reports have put the death toll at close to 3,000. This year is also off to an ominous start, as we saw in North Carolina and Ottawa last week. This week also marks the 15th anniversary of Hurricane Juan. So we wanted to bring together experts in emergency management, flood modeling and prediction, and evacuation traffic modeling to discuss emergency preparedness for future coastal risks and evacuation scenarios. Tomorrow, the MacEachen Institute will host a workshop on evacuation. We'll be joined by 25 experts from across the region. We've been studying questions of evacuation for the last couple of years, and we'll be soon starting a 2-year project to examine some key operational and strategic issues about evacuation in more detail. We would like to thank Defence Research and Development Canada for its contribution to this research. We'd also like to thank the Nova Scotia Emergency Management Office for supporting the application to DRDC. We would also like to thank the Marine Environmental Observation Prediction and Response, otherwise known as MEOPAR, which is a national network of excellence based here at Dalhousie that has supported this research on 4 separate occasions over the last 2 years and is supporting today's proceedings and tomorrow's workshop. And I'll just point out Professor Ron Pelot is in the back, who's the Associate Scientific Director of MEOPAR, and he's here today in support of our work. Ron will be chairing the roundtable later today at the MacEachen Institute, where we'll discuss these issues further with the second-year graduate students. So I'm just going to take a little unusual in this situation. I'm just going to take a few minutes to make a comment myself about the research, because this is a research area of my own and some area where I've been doing some thinking. So I'd like to sort of throw in some perspective from a sort of public administration accountability perspective on these issues. So mass evacuation of the Halifax Peninsula is an excellent case study because first, the city is on a hurricane path, and secondly, there are only 5 exit points from the peninsula, some of which can be blocked during extreme weather events, such as too windy to use the bridges, roundabouts and highways that are unusable due to flooding, and this all increases the uncertainty and the complexity of an emergency response. Understanding the complexity of evacuation requires a multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary approach. We need to think about operational issues. How do we get people off the peninsula? We need to think about who has the authority to do what. We also need to think about the human factor. Are people likely going to do what they are told? How do we run an efficient operation that is stable and fair? How do we coordinate all of the organizations that would be involved? We have a very distinguished panel today, and we'll get a glimpse of some of the expertise that is required to manage an emergency response successfully. So as a public administration scholar, I'm particularly interested in questions of accountability. Emergency and evacuation is a highly problematic space. I'd like to take a few minutes just to discuss this in more detail. Governments can assume considerable power over the lives of ordinary Canadians during emergencies. Governments can seize control of transportation by land and water, control the distribution and price of essential goods and services, enter private property without a warrant, and enlist the services of people to help. Yet it's very difficult to hold people to account for decisions they make and actions they take during emergencies. Mass evacuations in particular generate difficult decisions about how emergency managers and first responders should use their powers and expend their limited resources. Emergency managers are working under time pressure, shifting conditions, unclear goals, degraded information, and team interactions. Difficult questions can arise about who and how to help and in what order. Indeed, the Manitoba Court of Appeal recently affirmed that the government does not have an inherent obligation to assist citizens during an emergency. The federal government advises that during an emergency, people should be able to look after themselves for at least 72 hours. So questions abound. Should those responsible for mass evacuation be guided by saving the lives of most people, helping the most vulnerable, the most likely to die, survive, or the ones for whom they are responsible, such as prisoners or hospital patients? Which decisions are political and should be decided by politicians, and which are operational and should be decided by public administrators? Despite the uncertainty and normative ambiguity that underpins many decisions in mass evacuation, there are few laws, rules, or training plans that guide how emergency managers and first responders should address ethical dilemmas that occur during mass evacuations. Since 9/11, the field of emergency management has grown dramatically and now includes a number of actors that were not traditionally considered part of emergency management. The field has moved from traditional emergency response, such as police, fire, and ambulance, to include a number of critical infrastructure owners and operators, NGOs, healthcare providers, and volunteers. This expansion, however, has not included any considerable studies of the ethical dilemmas faced by those with the responsibility for mass evacuation. The ethical concerns that arise during emergencies have been explored from other perspectives, such as dilemmas faced by lawyers, engineers, search and rescue personnel, and the military. Medical issues have been given considerable attention, and this is perhaps something we can go on. There has been consideration of medical triage and rationing, the safety and emergency response in disasters, the imposition of quarantine. Post-SARS work in Canada generated an ethical framework for pandemics that included two categories to consider. One, ethical values, which includes accountability, inclusiveness, openness and transparency, reasonableness and responsiveness. And two, ethical processes, which includes duty to care, equity, liberty, privacy, proportionality, protection of the public from harm, reciprocity, solidarity, stewardship, and trust. These concepts are not easily balanced. Some compete with one another. In contrast, most literature on the evacuation takes the involvement of those with responsibility for mass evacuation as an uncontroversial good. If an emergency manager is acting competently, then the disaster will likely be viewed as excusing any suspension of individual rights. To the extent that the ethical dilemmas are considered, they are often framed as problems that can be solved by cost-benefit analysis in an effort to reduce the most human suffering. Media coverage after events tends to celebrate emergency services for, quote, a job well done. It is rarely critical. And you can see why. Emergency staff are going full out in the face of danger. In the face of the crisis, it's not necessarily the best time to have an ethics lecture. While evacuations and extreme events are rare, there are still examples of problematic decisions. Hurricane Katrina, Rita, and Harvey have demonstrated that decisions to evacuate is fraught with ethical dilemmas. In an extreme weather event, vulnerable populations will die if a city evacuates, just as vulnerable populations will die if they shelter in place. There are no risk-free options in this space. More people died in the evacuation of Hurricane Rita, for example, than died as a result of the hurricane itself. In Sherry Fink's account of Memorial Hospital in the days of Hurricane Katrina, she tells us how the hospital reversed the convention of helping most people in need of assistance to instead helping those most likely to survive. This decision was not without consequence. A grand jury was sworn in to hear the case, though ultimately declined to indict any of the suspects. In another prominent example, in the evacuation of New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, police officials shot fleeing members of the public who were trying to escape flooding by using a bridge that they had closed during the evacuation. Those officers were ultimately found guilty of crimes. There are also important and prominent Canadian examples. During the 2011 Manitoba floods, deliberate actions taken by emergency managers along the Assiniboine River displaced thousands of residents in order to save much greater numbers in the city of Winnipeg. The actions resulted in class action lawsuits. During the 2013 Alberta floods, police officers felt the public safety concerns justified forcibly entering homes and seizing firearms. During the BC summer wildfires in 2017 and 2018, emergency officials came into conflict with residents who refused to evacuate. Residents claimed that their local knowledge of the fires was not being respected by officials who called the evacuation. There are also jurisdictional issues. The federal government is responsible for First Nations evacuation, despite the fact that it's almost, in all other cases, it's a provincial responsibility. This raises questions about the coordination costs and the different practices between First Nations and provincial governments during mass evacuation. During the emergency response to the 2012 Algo Mall collapse in Northern Ontario, first responders evacuated the site out of concern for their own safety, despite the fact there may have been people trapped underneath the structure. After the staff abandoned the site, the government ordered them back. Was this appropriate? The ethics literature suggests that a thoughtful process is required to consider how to act in emergencies. Zach argues there's an obligation on the part of both individuals and governments to prepare adequately for disasters. Planning and preparation should occur during normal life, prior to any evacuation, and normal ethical values should apply. And so it's for that reason that we gather in relative calm and peace, I think, today, to reflect on some of these issues and deliberate and discuss their policy implications. So as we continue our research in this area, these are some of the questions we will be studying. There are others about which my colleagues will have a lot to say. So I'll pause now and introduce our first speaker. And the way we thought we would proceed is start at the outer limits with weather and the challenges around weather forecasting, and then we'll with Bob Robicheaux. Then we'll go to Eric Affleck, who will talk about Halifax's perspective, a Halifax perspective on emergency response. And then we'll go to Andrew Easton, who will talk about it from a New Brunswick perspective. And then we'll close with Hassan Habib, who will talk about traffic modeling that he and I are working on in this emergency response evacuation research project that we're doing. So Bob Robicheaux received his BSc degree in meteorology from Northern Vermont University at Linden in 1995. After a few years as a weather forecaster in the private sector, Bob joined Environment Canada in 1998 as an aviation forecaster in Gander, Newfoundland, where he eventually became Aviation Weather Program Manager for Atlantic Canada. In 2003, Bob managed the National Aviation Weather Services contract with NAV Canada, and he's also written a book on aviation weather in Eastern Canada. Bob moved to Halifax in 2004 to fill the new warning preparedness meteorologist role in Atlantic Canada, where his primary focus is working closely with emergency management officials on a variety of different weather-related issues, including training, exercising, and support during actual weather events. Bob Robicheaux.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, well, thank you, Kevin. Hurricane Juan, it's hard to believe that it's been 15 years already since Hurricane Juan. And as luck would have it today, this is actually 15 years to the minute that the storm that actually became Hurricane Juan actually developed. So September 25th at noon 2003, we had a storm out in the Atlantic that became Tropical Depression 15. Just a few hours later, 6 hours later, it became a named storm, Tropical Storm Juan, and it continued to intensify. It intensified through the night into the next day and reached hurricane status on September 26th. And at the time, the general outlook for the storm was for it to track towards mainland Nova Scotia. Now, as you'll see, one of the main challenges that we had was maybe not so much in the forecasting side of things, but on the communication side. So our message as the storm approached was basically we have a hurricane, likely landfall somewhere in Nova Scotia. We don't know exactly where, but it was too early to talk about impacts. That was the Thursday message that we had. Once we got into Friday, going into this nice weekend that was coming, we started to kind of ramp up our language a little bit. Towards the end of Friday, we started talking about numbers. First guess was about 110 kilometers per hour for wind speed, and potential heavy rainfall reaching 80 millimeters as well. And once we got into Saturday, now we started to cover, our models started to cover the period where the storm was actually going to make landfall. So as we were going on in our forecasting and our messages out to the media and to the public, the numbers kept going up. We went up from 110 to 120 to 150 kilometers per hour for wind speed. We talked about flooding along Halifax, the Halifax waterfront. We talked about a significant storm surge of 1.5 meters. And we talked about widespread blackouts as the storm approached due to the wind speed. And what ultimately happened at 12:10 on September 29th is the storm made landfall near the community of Prospect, Nova Scotia, with estimated wind speeds of 157 kilometers per hour with higher gusts up to 185 kilometers per hour. And that is right at the limit of a Category 2 hurricane. So we had a Category 2 hurricane make landfall just west of Halifax. What most people are going to remember for sure are the winds, the extreme winds that were associated with the storm. Lots of damage all across Nova Scotia, even into Prince Edward Island. Our highest wind speed that we reported on land was 178 kilometers per hour at McNabbs Island. We actually had a report of 231 kilometers an hour from a Coast Guard ship at the mouth of Halifax Harbor. However, their anemometer was at about 20 meters. Our standard height that we measure wind speed is at 10 meters, so we didn't actually count that. But it does fit the profile of stronger winds the higher up in altitude that you go. In terms of storm surge, the red line that you see there is the contribution of the water level as a result of the storm. So we did get a storm surge of 1.5 meters. The green line is the actual tide, the predicted tide, the actual water level if there was nothing else superimposed on that. So if you look at the tide peaked a couple hours before the peak surge occurred, and the orange line is actually the overall water level. So you can see that the peak surge occurred a little bit after the peak tide. Had that storm actually made landfall 2 hours earlier, we would have probably been looking at water levels 30 to 40 centimeters higher than they actually were. So as bad as it was, and we did set a new record for water level at 2.9 meters at Halifax Harbor, it could have been a lot worse had the storm just made landfall a couple hours earlier. And the bottom curve is the waves that were generated by the storm, peak waves of about 20 meters out over the open ocean. These are just a few images from the storm after the storm, basically all the storm surge and wave damage. Now, in terms of rainfall, because the storm was moving so fast, it didn't get an opportunity to dump a whole lot of rainfall. We did get some heavy downpours that did result in flooding in some areas of Halifax, but overall rainfall wasn't necessarily a big issue with the storm. It was more the wind and the storm surge. So our biggest challenge was not so much the forecasting side of things, but it was the communication side of things. Getting people to react to the storm that was approaching. One of the main things was people's experience or lack of experience with these types of storms, and certainly storms of this magnitude. The previous hurricane that had affected the Halifax area was Hortense back in 1996, caused some minor damage as a result of wind, not much in the way of storm surge. And that's what people remembered as to what a hurricane would do. This was a much, much stronger storm. We had a hard time getting that through to people. The timing of the storm played a pretty big role as well. It was a nice weekend. This hit like on a Sunday night into Monday morning. But leading up to that, it was a nice Friday, Saturday, Sunday. People were out doing what they like to do, trying to take advantage of the last nice weekend in September. And we also had problems engaging the media as well. Just prior to Juan, we had a major hurricane that made landfall along the mid-Atlantic states and came up through southern Ontario. Well, whenever we have a named storm impacting southern Ontario, the media really ramps up their messaging with these types of storms. We were trying to kind of convey that by the time the storm gets to southern Ontario, it's not going to cause a whole lot of impacts. But the media response was probably higher than what it should have been given the expected impacts. So now, fast forward a week later, when Juan is coming up, the media kind of took a step back from covering this particular storm. That was one reason. The other reason is a lot from a local perspective, a lot of these radio stations, local radio stations, go on what we call autopilot during the weekend, where they have either recorded broadcasts or it's done remotely. So we had a hard time getting the message through the local radio stations as well. So just to finish up, a couple of things that are different now compared to what we had when Hurricane Juan approached. One of the things we didn't have in our arsenal was to issue specific warnings for hurricanes and tropical storms. We changed that in the year that followed after Juan. We now have that capability, and which we've done a number of times. All we had at our disposal really was like a heavy rainfall warning and a wind warning, which you could get for any kind of storm. That didn't convey the nature of the destruction with this storm. The other thing is we handle media requests pretty much ad hoc as they came in. Now we have a very structured way of how we work with our media partners to get those messages out. If we look at the number of storms before and after Juan, before Juan, the 15 years prior to Juan, we had 3 landfall hurricanes here in Nova Scotia. Since Hurricane Juan, the 15 years since, we've had 2, so about the same. One of the things, the forecasts have gotten much, much better. The errors involved in predicting the track of a particular storm at 72, 48, and 24 hours have gotten a lot better. 72 hours is a very key time frame because, especially in the U.S., that's what they use to decide whether they're going to order an evacuation or not. So in 2003, the error forecast, the error bar on a 72-hour forecast was 354 kilometers. Now, today, it's 191 kilometers. So if you look at the track of a hurricane, that cone is 46% smaller than it was back in 2003. So the forecasts have gotten much better. And the last thing is really where we've made just amazing strides in the last 15 years is the structured way that we work with our emergency management partners. Back then, we didn't know them personally. We didn't have a structured way of communicating with emergency managers. Now, we know everybody on a first-name basis. I can tell you that the links and the partnerships that the weather side has with the emergency management side here in Atlantic Canada is tops in the entire country. And here in Nova Scotia, we're leading that, as now my office is embedded within the emergency management office for the province of Nova Scotia. So that's one of the main things that we've done in the last 15 years. And looking forward, one of the things that we're looking at is to engage the social scientists to see how we can better get our message out to the people who need to receive that message for decision-making purposes. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Division Chief Erica Affleck holds a Bachelor of Emergency Management, is a certified emergency manager, and a member of the International Association of Emergency Managers. She has significant experience in policy development, execution, and review of emergency plans. She's been recognized for her leadership in several significant emergency events in Canada and for her work as part of the Canadian delegation during multiple international efforts in planning for catastrophic events around the world. She joined Halifax Regional Fire and Emergency following a distinguished 32-year career with the Canadian military, including Commanding Officer, Joint Task Force Atlantic Headquarters, which was responsible for all domestic operations for the 4 Atlantic provinces. Erica.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'll let you.
Oh. Which, hit a button? There we go. There you go.
I can do as I'm told. Good morning, everybody. Such a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for inviting us. So today I'd like to focus on personal preparedness, and it's always nice to follow Bob because I will actually tie into many points that Bob spoke about this morning. And as he noted, and everybody else today, it's amazing that already we're at the 15th anniversary of Hurricane Juan. And it's quite apparent that the citizens of Halifax are much more prepared for an event of that nature should they need to stay at home or shelter in place. 15 years ago, having a generator at home was definitely in the minority and usually found for the country folk, you know, way out yonder. And it was like, oh, you have a generator. That sounds almost, you know, apocalyptic. Very, very odd. Now it would be very odd to live in a community where nobody had a generator and you'd be wondering what's wrong with these people. They don't have a generator. So, you know, again, amazing changes that you know, communities have come in 15 years. However, unfortunately, you know, when it comes to evacuations, we're not there, and we have not been so successful. So I've only been with Halifax municipality for just over 6 months as the emergency preparedness manager for the municipality, and I've personally encountered some large evacuations since I started. The first one, ironically, was in May, just after I did some TV spots and some radio spots on Emergency Preparedness Week. And 3 days later, I did my first evacuation in the middle of the night, and not one person had an emergency preparedness kit. So I really took a look in and said, what are we doing wrong? Obviously, you know, getting out there and promoting and the public education piece, it's not enough. So where do we go from here? How do we make the citizens of Halifax municipality better prepared and work with them so that if we do have to evacuate, they can safely get out and they do have exactly what they need. The next large evacuation was an apartment complex. The first one was in it wasn't hugely large. It was like 5 residents. We evacuated 10 to 15, but then the fire only affected the first bunch, so we allowed some people to go back home. But again, in that emergency preparedness week, not one person was ready. Nobody had emergency medication. Some people didn't even know the name of their insurance company. They didn't know who to call. So we set them up and we took care of them, but you can only take people so far on that personal preparedness side. And then the next one was the large apartment complex where over 150 apartment residents were evacuated, again in the middle of the night. Nothing ever happens between 8 and 4. And unfortunately, with this group of people, different dynamics. Some are on social assistance, and there we found no residence insurance, no list of medications, all thoroughly unprepared to be out of their home for any part of time, and the worst part was nowhere to go. So of course we look after that in conjunction with the province and different organizations, and we look after the people. And luckily during these evacuations, and we had a few more as well, and I learned things every time, the best way of doing business. The best part about it was that no major arteries were affected and the traffic flows were not affected so that we could move smoothly in the middle of the night. But again, we know that this isn't always going to be the case. Those are the things that keep me awake at night, wondering if we have a large event, how are we going to do that? So I think it's very important, all the work and all the knowledge that we bring here today, to work together. What I have found, though, is that as we go through, all communities, when you look at evacuation, are not created equal. From an evacuation standpoint. So I've personally been working with communities in different parts of Halifax Regional Municipality since I've started, and with other business units to look at how are we going to evacuate them. Because again, there is no cookie cutter approach that's going to work with the communities that we have. Halifax Regional has over 6,000 square kilometers, and we, you know, some have one road, so egress routes, ingress routes are a huge issue. Major choke points, as we all know, rural, urban, suburban, the list goes on. We all have a myriad of issues that go right across the board. What I can say is that it has to be one community at a time for me and my planning. Then as we go through and we look at other events, you know, all we have to do is look at the news this week and all of our friends and family in Ottawa. I'm sure we all know somebody there. We can be certain that other weather issues are now the new norm. So thank God we have Bob. But we need to be better at being prepared. And like Bob said, we get more notice now, so there are no excuses for when individuals are not prepared, other than if they don't have the resources to get themselves prepared or it's an education issue. But we really need to do a better job individually and making sure that we're all ready to go. So 15 years ago, again, you know, hard to imagine. So back then, you know, emergency plans, we had them, were they enacted? You know, I was here then, but I was with the federal side, so different perspective. What I can say from a municipality is that we now have over 400 registered emergency management volunteers. So that's huge. So we have ground search and rescue, we have joint emergency management groups that were formed after Hurricane Juan and after 9/11. So we have community input. We have amateur radio groups so that no matter what, we'll be able to talk to Russia and spaceships and everything else. My grumpy old men, as I call them, I love them dearly. They have the capacity to talk anywhere in the world. So are we better prepared? Absolutely, but we certainly have a long way to go. We also train them in emergency response so that they're ready to assist as well. But I would ask today that each of you have a look within yourselves and at your own preparedness, as every individual that is ready is one less person that is unprepared, and every person makes a difference. So in closing, I just want to expand a little bit on what Bob said about personal relationships and interactions. That is the key to emergency management. So I've been able to call Bob this week and email him. Right now we have, extreme weather. We have drought in provinces, or in parts of the municipality. So now we're in a spot where we have to get residents water. Residents have no potable water. They don't have any way. We have older residents live at home, don't have water to flush their toilets, don't have potable water, so there's safety issues. So, we lean on Bob and try to get, up to date. Is there rain coming? Is there not? Will we have enough? So it's not just hurricanes, it's preparedness as a whole. And, Bob talked about how we deal with each other better, and Halifax is the only place in Canada that has the 3 levels of government for emergency management in one building. The only place in Canada. So we are actually very blessed here that we work so well, and we have our partners inside. From a municipality, I know I would be lost without my provincial partners and the federal partners in one building, that we can literally go in and out of each other's workspace. So on that note, thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you, Erica. Andrew Easton is the Provincial Security Advisor for the Province of New Brunswick and the Executive Director of the Security and Emergencies Division of the Department of Justice and Public Safety. He leads the provincial security, critical infrastructure, and critical incidents programs, along with the emergency measures and 911 portfolios. A member of the Steering Committee of the Conference Board of Canada's Centre for National Security, Andrew holds a degree from Dalhousie University and certificates in Executive Management for Queen's University and National and International Security from Harvard's Kennedy School. Andrew remains a practicing paramedic of 35 years, including 9 years as a senior manager. Thanks for coming in today, Andrew, all the way from New Brunswick. Thank you.
Just touch the button. We do what we're told. Bob was remarking on an anniversary for me 30 years ago this month. I was sitting at the A&A building as a new graduate of Dal. Starting my second degree, the Dalhousie Faculty Association was thinking about, I don't know why I looked at you, was thinking about going on strike, and I decided it was time to go home and go to work. So I've been, but I'm a proud graduate of Dal and have many good experiences here that were helped form my approach. I practice as a paramedic here. And in fact, tonight I'm having dinner with my very first paramedic preceptor here, who was my training officer. So it's an honor to be back here in front of you. And here at my alma mater. I should mention I majored in many subjects, but not all of them had to do with academics while I was here. So I'm interested in the points, a couple of the points were made, and I'll echo some of them as well. I'm also interested in the points that Kevin made about ethical challenges and thinking about doing the right thing. Many of the comments I'm going to make are actually informed by research. Kevin and I and Dr. Pelot participated in 3 years of foundational research looking at organizational structures and approaches to managing in this space, not just emergency management, but security in critical infrastructure and in information sharing. So we've changed a lot of our policies as a result, and the importance of research is evident in this. So thank you for your academic interest in this subject. I'm fond of this quote because I think it helps. I mean, it's words from its time. It's a little sexist. It's a little dated. It's a little wordy. But I came across this as I was walking in Cambridge. I was down there for the seminar for a couple of weeks, and really it comes down to a statement of ethics. And are we able to do the right thing as public policy administrators? And are we guided? And I use the words from my very first deputy minister. His name is Jean-Guy Finn. Who's long since retired, but he's still practicing in the public administration space. He was a law professor at Université de Moncton, and his told me is that your first instinct as a civil servant should be to do the right thing. And from there, you work backwards for all the constraints that hold you back from doing what might be, in your opinion, in your expert opinion, what the right thing is to do. And security and emergency management in that space is no different. Constrained by different rules, different policy issues, different laws, and increasingly international space, which is challenging in and of itself. So I found these words, in fact, it's my screensaver. The UK National Security Strategy uses this statement, and there are many such strategies worldwide. Kevin knows that I'm fond of the UK Home Office approach on many things, and we've adopted some high-level learnings from that in our policy work. But this evokes some of the challenges that we're facing. I'd add a couple other ones to these around militantism and extreme views and polarization of views, and how the public today, your world, your bubble is your world. What you personally see in your space, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, your social media account, how you consume information, how you choose to process that information constrains what your views are. We become instant experts in our own domain. And we may be less and less likely, and perhaps I'd hope this room is more likely, to be more critical thinkers about what those is, but not everybody is. So these challenges and the faces we're making, and we only have to look a little bit to our south, and into even within Canada in terms of how we're addressing some of these international challenges and some of the economic and social pressures that we're under. This provides good context for us to think about what domain are we working in. Context is everything as we set policy, and context is even everything as you step forward through the operational door of what's the right step. I also want to recognize and make it clear is I'm not an emergency management expert. Most of the folks here are working in that domain. I've done some research on critical infrastructure and information sharing. My own expertise is more sharply shaped on the health and the security side, but there's a triangle there between the role of governments, the increasing role of a dominant private sector who owns over 90% of the critical things we depend on. In 1970, that was around 70%. Think of your dependency on that phone on your hip, on how you consume information. How much food in your fridge came from within the closest 100 kilometers? Think about those things that are dependencies. The third part of that triangle is our agencies who are charged with our expert agencies, whether they're emergency management agencies, security agencies, frontline first responders. And I'm proud to say that I came from a first responder family with my parents who are volunteer paramedics. I'm one. My wife is a senior police officer, and my daughter is about to go on to become a paramedic next year after she finishes a community degree at UNB. We're in that business. They are expert in their domain, and their execution of that will happen faster than you will ever influence. They have to be experts in their field, and they will execute based on their training. Think of all that context. This is a quote out of a lecture that I heard at HKS, and it comes from a whole domain in that world called meta leadership. And there's a specific discipline there. If you have an interest in the work that's being done there, I encourage you to Google meta leadership and Harvard Kennedy School, and you'll see a prof named Eric come up, who's an international lecturer. He'll be coming to talk to some of our senior leaders next year. You're in charge of nothing. At best, you can shape your environment in this domain. Now, there are command relationships. Our frontline first responders can walk up and say, you go here, you do that. Incident command structure is a thing, and you should be understanding how to do it. It grew out of military discipline. It functions well for managing the operational responses. But increasingly in that triangle domain of governments, the private sector, and agencies, they are in charge of what they're in charge of. They have an individual mandate. And the interweaving of those is exceedingly complex. What if they're international? What if you have no jurisdiction? You can have laws, pass a law, invoke the law. And if someone chooses to ignore the law or it doesn't apply to them, what can you do about it? Other structures are needed to do that. So shape, align, communicate, not necessarily command, particularly in the public policy space. So the tiers above the first responders become very important as well. Because if you don't force them to interact and create structures, they will do it independently, and it may not be to your benefit. So our government's taken an approach, every presentation fails when you put up an org chart. Every presentation fails. Okay, so please don't read this, but what I'd say is we've adopted loosely the concept in the UK of gold, silver, and bronze. Senior executives, regardless of rank, title, and function the same way. They lead organizations outside or within policy, mandate, and budget. At the silver level, it's senior operators who, within policy, mandate, and budget, ensure execution, and the bronze level carries out that execution. And there are different rank orders in there at the bronze level, from top-tier provincial level organizations down to the frontline truck who's showing up at the door. If you have more interest in this, happy to talk about it. I think we'll be doing more on it this afternoon. But we did create 3 domains. There's a security domain, very unique, increasingly important in this world with a fractured rules order-based system, and cyber threats. When we ask people what I worry about the most, is cyber. Not because I'm a security guy, but just because it is. A government committee and a private sector critical infrastructure committee. Kevin's participated. All operations fray. Black Swan is not just a term or a movie. Anticipate failure, mitigate, and react. You will not prevent failure. All systems fail. Physicians fail, hospitals fail, space shuttle failed. Our most complex systems fail. Anticipate, mitigate, and react. You cannot control narrative. You cannot control narrative. This gentleman here, his name is Rich Serino, Deputy Director of FEMA. This is Rich about 12 minutes after the explosions of the Boston bombings. I was privileged to be there and listen to those guys a year later. Little did I know, 5 days after that, I would be managing the government element of the government contribution to the Moncton shootings. I learned so much from this guy. Here's what he said: there are few true authorities. We're living in a feudal reality where everyone's bubble is what they can reach to, and that's how they consume their information and react. You have to shape and collaborate this in the space to create the opportunity for the management to be effective. It's a three-dimensional chess way of thinking. Command structures work only when they're enabled, but all operations fray. I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Dr. Hassan Habib is a transportation professor at Dalhousie University and a MacEachen Institute founding fellow. So if you were here last week, we introduced Hassan last week. He's the vice president of the International Professional Association of Transport and Health and vice chair of the Integrated Climate Change Committee of the Transportation Association of Canada. He's the founder of Dalhousie Transportation Collaboratory, and his multidisciplinary research agenda has attracted funding from all Tri-Council granting agencies. He received a PhD in civil engineering from the University of Toronto. Hassan.
Okay. So first of all, just to give you background before I start our talk today, I'm basically a transport modeler. Like, I try to understand how you choose your mode, what time you move from your home to the school, try to observe, and from that, try to build some sort of a model so that we can forecast for transportation planning purposes. So that was my background, that was my work through our DALTRAC research facility. But at some point in my academic career, I started realizing that hurricanes are real when you live in Halifax, right? And I have a very vague memory of myself growing up in a very coastal region of Bangladesh. That's where I'm from. And that has repeated hurricanes and flooding issues, and still there are. So I got interested in, can we use the models, the predictive tools, the simulation that we are doing for this particular application, like if we need to evacuate. And we are talking about evacuation, at least in my presentation, is a mass evacuation. When we are talking about, say, all people in Peninsula, or 1.7 million people from recent Hurricane Florence, like they did. And so bigger kind of event, what happens to our transportation network? So that was like kind of our collaboration. We started with Kevin. Oh, let's start asking. Kevin was asking all the questions, and I'm trying to make those into a numbers. Can we see what are the scenarios? Can we test those kind of things? So I will try to give a very brief history, very brief description of like the kind of work we are doing last 3 years. Obviously, we don't want in any type of those scenarios. You saw Irma, heard about it, Harvey, and Florence, and some of you probably got a good handle on the Juan from our first speaker's presentation. And I just heard one of my students who is working on that. She was grade 1 when Juan hit. So I would like to see how she handles this research question. But what we don't want is like a Katrina, or like Harvey. After the fact, you need both to evacuate. So as a researcher, unlike our first responders who will be making decisions as it happens, I want to learn beforehand how we can imagine, see the scenarios, what are the problems in the transportation network. So that's our job. And you might probably realize whenever you hear about hurricane in the news media, what do you most likely try to watch? What kind of things? Category 5, so numbers, path, right? Like those cool stuff, like where they are hitting, right? And Bob and other guys are really, they went quite far ahead in really predicting where there will be a twist. Like this year, the Florence just took a twist in the North Carolina just before landing on the North Carolina landfall. But despite us, transportation engineers and planners, are modeling for last 40 or 60 years, from 60s, we couldn't predict yet, how we are moving, not just during the emergency period, but even just general time, what happens, if we could simulate and really forecast how your travel behavior is evolving and it will evolve through time, we probably could have a better roads, better transit, better active transportation routes, right? That's in a way, as an academician, I'm also concluding on that. And that is why we are trying to learn and build this type of model to learn. So you'll see this is actually our model results from traffic forecasting for mass evacuation of the peninsula. So that is our motivation here. So we are trying to learn how we can accurately, or most closely we can represent, given that the system is complex, the same way the weather system is complex, but that's probably a multi-billion-dollar model. Ours is not as costly as that, but we are trying to understand both systems, the kind of road network signals and all of those, as well as their choice-making processes, because you guys make your choice, and that's what we need to reflect within our traffic simulation model. So how we did this particular project, I will go a little bit faster here just to give a snapshot. I don't have hours to talk. So what we did is took some sort of a model output from flood risk model. One of our collaborators from NSCC, Tim Webster, and Kevin worked on that, and then we have a traffic network model, which is more regional scale model, which gives us your origin and destination by zone, so that we know where you generally go on a daily basis. And then we did this traffic microsimulation to specifically focus on the peninsula to see how the vehicle moving, where the bottlenecks are, where the delays are, where the congestions are. So that's generally speaking what we built. So our traffic flood risk model gave us this kind of scenario, say 2.9 meter flood. We are losing some networks, 3.9, 7.9, 15 meter, and 30 meter. Halifax become an island, and I stopped modeling that one. I thought I was only calling Navy at that time. So the scenarios that we chose is 2.9, which is the highest during the Juan, as well as a little bit more extreme 3.9 and 7.9 to just make sure we are covering all those kind of things. Just a quick output for what kind of connectivity we lose in terms of flooding our highways, Bedford Highway, rotary, or other kinds. You see that increasingly we are losing rotary for each flood level, as well as Bedford Highway goes off 50% almost when it's 7.9, but we are fine with the 2.9 and 3.9. So you can see, so we implemented those within our traffic simulation model. This is the simulation piece, so we put everything, links, traffic signals, delays, red lights, all of those type of things. My PhD student did some fancy things to validate, to get the degree, but at the end we tried to validate so that we see like what's the differences between the scenarios. And you can see the first scenario is the base case scenario, meaning there is no flood, but this is mass evacuation order. We got at 10 a.m., that's what we assumed, when the highest number of people leave within peninsula. It doubles, like with the residents and the commuters. So that's the peak hour destination, like all of those things. So we model that piece. That's our base case, and then we have the flood risk scenarios. And I will just quickly show a snapshot of the results. So if there is no flood, if there is flood, say 2.9, it takes that to evacuate entire peninsula 13 hours. If it's 3.9, 15 hours. And if no flood, even there is no flood, it's 11 hours. So it's big. It's a big number. And we have assumptions, of course. We assume that there is no congestion, no accident, no incident. Everybody is on the carb side. No grandma is refusing to change their route with their car. So we assume the ideal case. So it looks like a little bit, and we can only evacuate 83%. And our evacuation in the first 4 hours is fine. Then we got gridlock. If you want to learn more about the results, you can imagine when the bridge didn't open, how we got gridlock. So that's the scenario we get in our simulation model. We now are thinking, a couple of our students, what are the possible countermeasures, how we can improve better, efficient movement. A couple of ideas is emergency traffic management. I understand from the Bob's work, like you guys have a very nice collaboration with emergency management services and the weather prediction, but I found weaker linkages with the transport officials, with the traffic authorities, like those who might be offering you school buses for the mass evacuation. Like we couldn't find, even not just in Halifax, it's a wide scale in the United States, it's wide scale in Canadian context. We haven't had yet the operational pieces for the mass evacuation very, very well done. Like what will be the temporary signage for this contraflow? We don't know which link get closed. What is the evacuation measure thoroughfare? What are the marshal points? We have marshal points, but not well publicized, well communicated. So we are trying to develop those type of things. What could that transit evacuation means? What should be our shelter location? Like if there is something like Florence coming to us. So do we have those scenarios tested? And what will be the staged evacuation? Erica mentioned one community after one community they prefer, but how we decide on the one community versus one community, that ethical dilemma Kevin was talking about. So we will try more using this model to find out what type of strategy could work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hassan. And we're actually running on time, which is super. So we're going to pivot now to our student questions. So just to familiarize everyone with how we will proceed, we have 5 students who have who signed up to ask a question this week, and they are asked to direct their question at one person in particular. So if someone from the panel is dying to jump in who wasn't asked, you are free to do so. But we like to try to have one question, one person, just so we can get through as many people as possible. So we've asked the students to direct the question at one person in particular. We'll go through the 5 students who have prepared questions for today, and then we'll open it up to everyone else. And I'm getting a message from Tori.
One quick note, there are some questions coming in from online, so I'll just say those into the
Okay,
microphone.
so we'll start with those after the, at least we'll track one anyway after we do the students.
Right.
Thank you. So we will start with Chioma Azubike Okoro with the first question.
Hello, so my question is for Erica Fleck. And what considerations go into which victims are prioritized during an evacuation? Like, would people with special needs or the elderly be given first priority, or which people give?
So that's not an easy question to answer, but what I can say is, so for example, the communities that we're going into and working on the evacuation plans with them, and I'll use one community in particular. It was my first one that we started on. So when we went into the community and said, here's the evacuation routes, we did up an evacuation plan with their streets and egress points, muster points, where they would go, if they were available to go by car. And then that's when the community members came back and said, one in particular said, my mom's in a wheelchair, can you take that information and what will you do with it? And I said, if you want to give us any information, we will input it so that if any fire or emergency service goes to that house, we know that there's somebody in there that's wheelchair bound and we can react appropriately. And then we know ahead of time that we know we need more resources, and so issues like that. So an entire community came forward and said, can you take my information? We encouraged them to put signs on their doors that, if there were animals inside and things like that. So would they be evacuated first? It all depends. So unfortunately, there's no exact situation that you can plan for. It's never, that magic is never gonna happen. No plan ever survives contact. I'm sure you've heard that saying. And so when you're going in to evacuate, depending on what the issue is, so fire, for example, you always evacuate, the most critical piece first. And so if there were people that we knew that were, say, wheelchair bound in there, we would send additional resources to start getting them out, even if they weren't in that critical piece, because we would know it might take a little bit longer. But again, it's self-identifying so that we know that there are issues in there. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. We're going to go to Alexander Barry, but before we do, I just want to insert a little observation here because I've been thinking about it this week. One of the challenges around public policy is we do get a little bit fixated and a little siloed in our approach to policy. And last week we had a panel on housing, and one of the papers on our reading list talked about how more and more seniors are moving into the city and buying condos, right? And so what we didn't talk about, we talked about how great that was, they were making those choices, but that does mean that you're potentially concentrating vulnerable populations into an urban center and in a condo that could cause other problems. So one of the challenges around policy analysis today is thinking across policy spaces and not, fixating just on whatever the topic of the week is, right? So last week it was about housing, and it's great that everyone's coming into the city, but then there are, on the flip side of it, the next week we're talking about emergency management. How would you evacuate those populations if there was a crisis on the peninsula? Anyway, just something to think about, the complexity around policy analysis, working across organizational lines. So now we'll go to Alexandra.
Hi, my name is Alexander Barry. I'm a master's student in public administration here at Dal. My question is for Andrew. Do you believe that Canada should have a long-term strategic infrastructure plan for emergency management, such as the way that New Zealand has a 30-year infrastructure plan? If yes, what would you want this plan to entail? For example, would you want the plan to be nationwide or rather provincial/regional? If no, why would you not support such a plan?
So I need to understand what you mean by strategic infrastructure for emergency management.
Meaning preparing for, in the future, for climate change, for different issues that might arise in the next 30 years. So rather than having a plan that's short-term, let's say 5 years, looking more towards the future.
So you can see some elements of that in planning, and I'd have to defer to my expert, who isn't here, is the Director of Emergency Management for EMO for New Brunswick. But you see things like the National Disaster Mitigation Plan. You see things like the Green Infrastructure Plan identifying specific areas to mitigate. I'm aware, and you may be aware, of resource planning and critical infrastructure planning around the Tantramar Marshes between New Brunswick and the Chignecto Strait in terms of its vulnerability to everything from storms to flood elevations. I think you're beginning to see some of those elements engage. So I wouldn't say that that's specific to emergency management, but to me that's about protecting supply chains. And supply chains are not physical nodes. They are in fact virtual physical electrons that are nodes along a chain that enable the delivery of key services. And you have to protect those. So you do see an increasing awareness of that. Some of that is climate change driven. Some of it is cyber resiliency driven. Some of it is driven out of people feeling vulnerable. And earlier today we were talking about 72 hours. And I'm going to pick on a comment or an anecdote from a friend of mine who said, is we used to be prepared for 72 days of emergency in Canada. It was called winter. So would you be ready in 72 hours is nowhere near enough. We've learned that. I've been out of power personally 9 days and 11 days twice in the last 5 years. I have a generator. I don't have enough fuel to be ready for 9 days. I can ration it, but I wouldn't be enough to keep everything charged, keep potable water moving. We actually need to think more deeply than just the infrastructure. Resiliency is more core. It's the combination of infrastructure, personal and societal readiness, supply chain readiness, which is private sector primarily, and governance, and the intersection in that space. And I talked about a triangle, and it's multi-levels of government in that. So I think you're beginning to see people move, to answer your question. It's not specific to emergency management. It's more about supply chain resiliency, but it is moving in that direction. And we're probably behind. You see places internationally, Australia, Professor, you're in Bangladesh, even where people have moved significantly to move whole populations away from risk areas because they've been faced with the inability to deliver civil society there. The other challenge I just put onto the end of that is that you need to be prepared for the concept that civil society doesn't hold in a crisis. You were remarking on evacuating here. How long would people be tolerant of strictures around evacuating? How long does it take? It was an MI5 speech. A guy from MI5 gave the speech, and then it was promptly erased from the internet. I don't know how that happened. Called 4 Meals from Chaos. It's literally over 10 years old, and I was studying the truckers' blockades in France as what communities where civil society broke down and riots, food riots and pressures became an issue. So it's a whole complex of infrastructure, societal, personal, and physical, that has to be established.
Amy Hill.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Amy Hill. I'm also an MPA student here at Dal. My question is for Asan. So as we've seen in the past years, climate change has contributed to an increased frequency and complexity of natural disasters. I'm from BC. We've had a pretty rough couple summers with the wildfires. We're expecting the big one sometime soon. So my question is, how can governments balance the need for long-run, robust infrastructure investments in anticipation of these natural disasters with short-term political incentives, which may tend towards more reactionary spending after these disasters?
Great question. Probably for the government officials, because I can put my 2 cents on. I think there needs to be quite a big attention given for the strategic decisions, for the long-term decisions. We know climate change is real. It's not fake news. And the governments have done so. Like there are a lot of programs right now running for climate change mitigation, adaptation program as a part of it. Anything that we build as a capital project for the infrastructure, we are keeping that thing eye on. So there is increasing attention to this long-term possibility of the sea level rise, how we prepare our communities, how we prepare all those resiliencies embedded with the communities. So from the infrastructure point of view, there is that long-term thinking already in place. For the short term is always needed. Like that gets the priority, even if we have those long-term things. When there is a wildfire, or if we see the Fort McMurray kinds of incidents, like all those type of things, like get the priority. But if we invest more for the long-term infrastructure and long-term strategic planning for these kind of things, which we are anticipating is a new norm. Hurricanes, like more hurricanes, new norm, more different kind of extreme weather events are new norm. So investing strategically for the long term will reduce the cost and burdens for the short term as well. So that's what I think.
Alex Rescanu.
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm an MPA student here at Dalhousie University. The question is for Mr. Bob Robicheaux. Since Hurricane Juan impacted Halifax 15 years ago, are you seeing an increase or decrease in the number of natural disasters that are occurring in Canada? And is the Department of Environment and Climate Change better positioned to alert residents about upcoming emergency situations?
Yeah, that's definitely a good question. And if we look at the cost associated with natural disasters, there's no question that in the 15 years since Hurricane Juan that's going up, and that's going up extremely rapidly. Some of it has to do with climate change. Some of it has to do with the fact that we simply have more stuff. And what we have is more expensive. The tablets, the computers, you know, the cars are more expensive. So if we look at from a cost perspective, sure, that's going up, and that's going up extremely fast. But we definitely have had some major events in the last 15 years, some of which that we have never really seen before. The example just over the past weekend in Ottawa that was mentioned earlier, to have an EF3 tornado towards the middle of the month of September is certainly a very unusual event. The floods that we saw in New Brunswick this year is another good example of, you know, record kind of events. One of the things that I really kind of latch on to as maybe some kind of a worst case scenario for here in Nova Scotia was a hurricane post-tropical storm Sandy type of event that occurred along the mid-Atlantic states, New York City, back in 2012. That storm was absolutely enormous in terms of its size and generated about a 4-meter storm surge in parts of New York City. And that wasn't necessarily a pure hurricane when it made landfall. If we get a storm of that magnitude making landfall in Nova Scotia, that would probably supersede what we saw with Hurricane Juan. And in terms of what we're doing at Environment Climate Change Canada, one of the biggest things that we've done, in fact, one of my colleagues from Ontario who's just been dealing with the Ottawa situation is retiring today. And in his goodbye email to people that he knows within the organization, he said that one of the best moves that Environment Canada has ever made is the creation of what we call warning preparedness meteorologists, which is what I do, and there's one of me in each province in Canada, and what we do is to work hand in hand with emergency managers to get the information to who it needs to go in a timely fashion so the proper decisions can be made.
Emily Vickers.
Hi, I'm Emily, and my question is for Andrew Easton. So we were talking about how security and emergency is in an increasingly international field. And we've seen in the U.S. how a constant state of emergency has emerged since 9/11 and terrorist attacks. So my question is, how do we instill the urgency of international permanent emergencies, such as climate change, while generating productive change and not instilling fear or coming up with policy consequences and security consequences like we've seen in the U.S.?
I think that governance is key, and it has to be tied to evidence. We are hopeful to move towards a model where we look very closely at what threats, risks, and vulnerabilities exist. A threat, risk, vulnerability assessment is a formal process where you balance what are the risks and probabilities of things versus what the impacts are. As an example, we've been talking about evacuations a fair bit up here. Evacuations aren't benign. People get hurt during evacuations. Evacuating a hospital causes morbidity and mortality. So you have to balance every action against the reaction and the probability with the eventuality that's there. Making sure that people understand that generally we live in a safe and secure and resilient place is good, with some evidence, and giving people capacity individually so they know what to do if there was a tornado warning. And all of our cell phones were to start to honk here like they did in Ottawa last week. And Bob was talking about warning preparedness meteorologists. The alert that was generated in Ottawa, and it's only a 5-month-old system, Bob, went out on alert ready. And there was a nice news story on CBC about two young boys who their dad got the notice, got a message at home to get the boys out of the backyard, and the treehouse they were playing in went away. So, but the balance of those systems also has to be balanced with an informed public, an informed private sector, and an informed set of governments, not just one government. And you got to put it in a governance frame. Tying governance to accountability is the next step. So after our ice storm in La Péninsule Acadienne in northeastern New Brunswick, our clerk of the Executive Council did a study which became public. One of the recommendations in there, which has been accepted, is to make all of our action plans against findings. So every event is reviewed, some of them quite superficially, like the small ones. Other ones, it's a year-long, year-and-a-half-long event. That the action plans for each of those are actually made public, and progress against addressing those actions is public. And the public can make decisions about whether or not it feels it's getting effective governance. Now, how do you balance that with the private sector, who's regulated 15 different ways? How do you balance it against somebody who's got no obligations to react? And what's the public obligation of a citizen to be ready? Those are tougher things. But I think the main thing is to put a little bit of evidence, a lot of evidence. Take the sting out of the fear factor of there's a bad person around every corner, or there's a tornado or a climate change thing that's going to eat you up, and try to put it in a better frame. And if people feel capable, they react better. The last part is relationships and trust, both during the event and prior. So building that governance framework that I flashed up here, the terrible organogram, is all about having people who actually have worked together a little bit before the bad day. So when you talk to them on the other end of the phone, I've never met Bob before. I've heard you, I don't know how many times on a phone, but he's a voice of trust, right? We know that that's going to be the analytics that's going to help us do what we need to do and inform us. We have Joe Mapia, who fulfills a similar function for New Brunswick, not so much on the hurricane side. I have an expert emergency manager. His name is Greg McCollum, former military guy who instills confidence every time he opens his mouth. People trust his voice to say this is what the right thing to do is. And those voices, Erica and others like that are professional emergency managers or that frontline first responder, that trust relationship is key. Post 9/11, there were some very credible elected officials that came forward, spoke credibly about how they were going to recover. They were going to bring everything to bear to deal the right things to the right places. And then they asked the experts to step forward and speak to the details. That's not small. Right? And losing that trust is building it, and then spending it is important when you think about these kinds of issues. Hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to the students for preparing those questions for us to get us started. Tari, did you say we had an online question?
Yes. So this question, it was asked by Doug Kirkpatrick from the MacEachen Institute Advisory Council, I believe. So the question is, it wasn't directed at anyone, unfortunately, but the question was, will you comment on the use of social media in emergency situations, and in particular on the requirements to adapt traditional incident management systems to accommodate this speed of social media communications and crowdsourcing?
Who wants to take that one? Erica wants
Sure.
to take it. Yes, Erica.
So it's quite positive for the most part, and as an emergency manager, we rely on social media to get word out. Do we need you to get somewhere? Road closures. I work very closely with Transportation and Public Works. We all have partners that we deal with on a regular basis. So when you look at social media, when you look at that sign, anybody who drives across, the bridges in Halifax, between Halifax and Dartmouth, we talked yesterday, so we have a partner with the Halifax Bridge Commission. So in an emergency, I have the ability now, as of yesterday, to be able to send to their system to put notification up on those big signs that we see as people are crossing the bridges. So we can put notifications out, not just, the standard ones, Facebook and Twitter, but when we talk about social media, it's also in the library. So all those TV screens in the libraries, they're all connected in every library in the municipality. So we've been sending messaging out that way as well. So we have to use it to our advantage because it is today's technology. And it's also a source of preparedness as well. So if you lose your phone and you have to get out of your house quickly, the clouds are wonderful, right, for storage of personal documents. So, taking pictures of your passports or prescription medications, taking pictures and storing them somewhere so that you can access them, getting the information out on comfort centers and evacuation centers, muster points, where people can go find their loved ones, that will set up communication-wise. It's key to emergency management in 2018, and it's only going to get better. It has its downsides because people snapping pictures and posting things that are not always verified and true, of course, always gets in the way, but we have to remain and work with what we have, and we have to stress the positive aspects and use it to our advantage.
Erica, I'm just going to follow up on this with one other question. So, of course, on September 11th, the cell phones all failed, right? The cell phone tower went down.
Yep.
And I guess I wonder, the flip side of it is, are we becoming too dependent on these technologies?
Absolutely.
That should something happen, is there kind of this is what we'll do if we've got the cell phones, and this is what we're going to do if we don't have the cell phones, right?
Yeah.
I mean, young people don't typically see themselves as vulnerable in these situations, but young people live in small apartments and condos and high rises and depend on cell phones. So actually, there are a lot of vulnerabilities embedded with the younger population as well. But what's your reaction to that? Have we become too dependent, or do we have to have almost two risk management plans, one where they work and one where they don't? Or
we do, absolutely. So that's a really good example, and it's one that I looked at from a business continuity standpoint for the municipality as a whole. So when we had that fiber cut last year, actually it was just last August, and we had a large fiber cut in Halifax and nothing worked. So I had to look at, okay, if everything is working, communications-wise, this is how we will communicate. If something happens and we can't communicate, as we are now used to, what do we do then? And so we had to build in those plans. And so again, we have to build redundancy all the time. So it becomes more challenging as we become more dependent, because we have, again, more redundancies, more depth, more levels, so that we can react in a quick and timely fashion. So it's, again, good and bad.
Andrew?
It's just another supply chain. And so it's how you supply information. It's a routine question now to encounter. In 2014, during Hurricane Arthur, or Tropical Storm Arthur, by the time it got to Fredericton, and the Fredericton area was the hardest hit, we actually work with the private sector. And we challenge our partners to say, here's our problem. Anybody got any bright ideas? And it's almost that simple. In that particular case, is both a number of the private companies have VPN-based internet access, private networks. We put posters up in every Tim Hortons and every Irving because we had a private sector network that enabled us to get that. Here's key messages for today. And we changed those every morning. And they agreed to do it, and they were happy to do it. They took a little bit of pride in doing it. They also took a little bit of a bow for participating, and that reputation management's positive. We similarly, during the same event, we had, we worry about winter here, but who would have thought that we would have been faced with food storage issues in the middle of July from the same event? So we had a very bright guy from one of our private companies that spoke up on one of our critical infrastructure calls and said, have you thought about slush ice? And I don't know what he was talking about. He's from the South Shore of Nova Scotia, worked in a fish plant, and he said salt ice takes forever to melt. It's colder than regular ice, and it's transportable. You have fish plants all along the shore. get them to truck ice to you. So we started with the assistance of some of our private companies. Within less than 30 minutes, I had a commitment, and with less than an hour and a half, the first truckload left.
Right.
And we delivered those everywhere. So, you know, society is quite resilient if you enable it. But you have to think about enabling it and not allowing dependency. If you allow dependency to build, people put all of their trust in one thing, or all their expectations to government or to local officials, and that's not feasible.
Question from the floor. Let's go to the very, very back. There we go. And there were a couple of other hands. Can I just see those other hands? Yeah, okay.
Hi, I'm Dana. I'm in the Masters of Resource Environmental Management program. And something more practical about the emergency preparedness that I was wondering about was about like prescription medications and how you have to bring those with you, obviously. But the issue is like you can't stockpile your medication. You can only get a new round of medication after you've used it. So how do you sort of address that issue? I realize that's not at all a policy issue. I'm curious.
No, and that's an easy one to answer, actually, so thank you for asking. So my recommendation, based on personal experience, is I have, my son has asthma. So he takes these pills on a regular basis. And so I have 3 or 4 of them in a little bag or a little can in our emergency preparedness kit, so that if we have to leave the house quickly, nobody's ever going to remember and go get the pill bottle from wherever, or whatever it is that you need. But there's enough in there to get you, you know, at least for a couple of days. And then you can go to any pharmacy in an emergency situation, show them your prescription. So I have pictures to say, you know, this is what we have, and you can go and get that filled. And just about every pharmacy will give you an emergency refill on something in the event of a crisis. Yeah.
I recall that there's one American study, like it was a congressional report on a disaster. I don't know if it was Katrina. And it starts off with the sort of heroes. Disaster accounts always have heroes and villains, and this person was a hero because he broke into a drugstore, because people couldn't get access to drugs, and started handing out drugs to the people who needed it. And I thought, wow, that could have gone really wrong. Like, but that person was clearly one of the heroes who wasn't, you know, waiting on the red tape. That was the way the story was told. I saw it a little differently. Anyway, please go ahead.
Hi, my name's Brittany. My question's directed to you as well, Erica. I study disaster and emergency management through Royal Roads currently in BC, a distance program. My question is related to personal preparedness that you talked about, and it kind of relates to social media as well, where I recently read a study that sharing your preparedness is actually one of the main ways that other people decide to prepare. So I was wondering what the goals are as far as yourself looking into personal preparedness for the public, and are those goals measurable as far as the emergency management office?
So that's a really good question. So again, we're working on KPIs as key personnel indicators or performance measurement, and how do we do that? And that is kind of a tricky one. You normally find out if somebody's ready through a bad event or through a negative event, unfortunately. But we are trying to capture that data as we go through. Fire in particular is what we're doing. We're going back to, as we call, old school kind of fire. We're stopping by people's houses, you know, maybe more vulnerable populations, as we would call them, wellness checks, knock on their door. How are you doing? Do they have, you know, valid smoke detectors? Do they have, you know, are they easily able to get out of their homes if in the event of an emergency? Are they prepared? So we're capturing data that way. And then social media. It's a good question. So I've personally been trying, so every Tuesday, for example, we do social media posts on emergency management. And so I try, you know, kind of the topic of the week. So the last week, and now that I realize it's Tuesday, I missed today. Thanks for the reminder. I knocked that one out. It's still early, yeah. The day's not over. So last week it was about dry well issues and safe drinking water, and what do you do to get yourself safe drinking water. So like I mentioned at the very beginning, potable water is an issue right now in a lot of our communities. They've been without, their wells have run dry on the 16th of September. So that's a long time to be without potable water. So how do you do that? And right now, unfortunately, all the water that's pouring into the ground is just evaporating, so it's not enough to stay, and that causes issues with wells. So we're very concerned with some of the populations. So again, we're getting that message out on social media, and, you know, talking to them about this is what you do, and we use best cases, we use examples. I put a picture on every week of something, hopefully that's, you know, tied to an event that we've dealt with to get that message out there. And yeah, unfortunately, we keep having things to share, which is good and bad. Bad that it happened, but good that we can actually learn from each other's mistakes.
Great. Is there another, there was a question here. Oh, there is. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, my name's Michelle Raymond, and I actually spent a fair while in the provincial legislature in representing a completely disaster-ridden constituency. So, I mean, I began with Hurricane Juan in the first few days of my tenure, and I realized that people living in town were having far more difficulty than the people who were in Sambro, which actually bore the brunt of that hurricane because they knew exactly how to hook up a truck as a generator and all the rest of it. Nobody had any difficulties at all. But my question, I guess, would be for you, Andrew. I think when you're talking about a feudal reality, I think you're probably talking about the fragmentation of the information realm, are you? But you also spoke about the privatization of critical infrastructure, and I guess that's largely communications infrastructure and so on. And you talked also about trust. And my probably first experience with this was perhaps when I had children in school, and every parent was asked to prepare a disaster plan or an emergency plan for their child. And that was all well and good. This would not happen exactly today, but it was not until one day when the school needed to be emptied that it was realized that every single parent's plan involved their child going to the office telephone and calling home. So we ask people to prepare their individual plans, but do we have a space in which those individual plans can be checked against each other to make sure that they don't all conflict terribly? Just going on, I mean, the peninsula of Halifax, the near island of Halifax, which, in which we're asking everybody to concentrate and in which we have zoned most of our business, is just a classic example of this in traffic. How do we ask people to cross-check their individual plans, and whose responsibility is it to make sure that individual disaster plans don't all conflict with each other?
It's not a simple question with no simple answer, but my advice would be is that the simplest way to test community preparedness and allow individual preparedness to be tested are exercises. So exercises have multiple benefits. One is it tests plans, tests assumptions. The second thing is that it builds relationships and trust. It develops, if properly designed, develops fractures, things that don't work so well. You can design an exercise to be a training exercise or to be a validation exercise to see, like, you're going to strain the system and see just how far things will take. Schools do active shooter, shelter, hold and secure exercises for that reason, so that they learn what things don't work well. So do communities. Most emergency planners they'll have a frequency of how often that they need to do exercises, whether they're in the private sector or in the public sector domain, and they'll set that. Similarly, for major events themselves, that's why we do reviews. And that's why we're making those results public of those reviews, to say, this is how we did, and this is what the high level results. This is not the little micro. And some reviews you can't. If it's a security exercise, there's reasons not to. But the action plans against vulnerabilities can be, we're gonna do better here, we're gonna do better there. There's no way for government to impose practically a requirement that people validate themselves. I mean, people gotta own some of their own responsibilities. And we see that when emergencies happen. You mentioned I live in a rural area, I got a generator, I got all my own stuff, but some people will choose not to evacuate. Other people will be vulnerable and have not the means, not the education, not the capability of doing it. So there are always parts of the system that will fail, and then you learn to anticipate, mitigate, react to pick up those pieces as they occur. So overlaps, I don't think there's any practical way if everyone says I'm going to evacuate to the same shelter and then the shelter holds 50 but 200 people show up. You can't plan for all of that, but you can exercise things and see where the cracks are. And the more you exercise, the more resilient this community will be to say, oh, okay, we can't use this shelter, we'll just all open up this one. And people become quite flexible, particularly if they feel in control, like the wave's not overwhelming them. They're still on top of the issue. Eventually, though, communities get tired. People get tired. The media story will shift from the heroes to the villains. All those things are normal. There's a rhythm to these things as they occur, and you have to anticipate that too as it comes out in the system.
Do you mind if I expand on that?
No?
Just so there is some legislation. And municipalities are actually by law, and so for Halifax it's E100 to have an emergency management bylaw. And part of that is planning and exercises, as Andrew mentioned. So we do exercise quite regularly. And one of particular note is nursing homes are actually under provincial legislation, but they work with the municipality, and I'm a board member for Special Community Emergency Preparedness Association, which takes into most of the nursing homes and all special community homes within the municipality. So that's group homes for challenged adults and things like that. So they are mandated by law to exercise for evacuations and for emergency preparedness. And I actually go out with the fire marshal from the province in the municipality, and we go out and we work with them every year for their exercise period, because they have to submit by legislation to say that they are prepared. Yeah. On top of that, just a point though, a lot of what you're talking about is business continuity as well. And so for the municipality, so I've done a business continuity plan for all business units within government, within the municipality. And so part of that was, where do you go in the event that your building is, you can't go there for whatever reason? Whether it's, a natural disaster, or, it could be a gas leak, it could be an event of terrorism, cyber, it could be anything that you can't go. And so what we did find is that, different business units said, well, I'll go here and I'll go here. And we did have overlap. So we've sorted that out. And now everybody, and we've exercised it, and we're exercising it again next month, is that every business unit will go to an alternate location, and they are now mandated to have a plan. And I have a copy of all their plans in the event of an emergency.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your thoughts on those questions. Thank you to the community members who asked the questions. Thanks to the students for participating and reflecting on those questions in advance. I really enjoyed this panel. I hope our panelists did. I know our audience must have, so please join me in thanking our panelists today. So as is the custom, I'll offer them a token of our appreciation after the round table at the MacEachen Institute, because you've got to go right to the finish line to get a token of our appreciation. But they'll be going for lunch now, and then they'll be joining us at the MacEachen Institute in about an hour's time. So thanks again, and we will close this part of the class for now and reconvene in about 15 minutes. Okay? Thank you.